All right. Okay, and now I'm going to plug my phone in so I don't lose battery. Okay, I think we are all set. So thank you so much, Jackie, for going through the slides for me. And thank you everyone to, figure out how to get connected here today. I know it's a little tricky to manage when the internet goes out, but I'm glad that we're all so resourceful in our technology that we can be here together today to talk about ungrading. So, I don't know how many people were able to attend the keynote speaker session this morning with David Clark and Robert Talbot on grading for growth, or if you were able to attend the follow-up session that John held on alternative grading systems. But I absolutely encourage you guys to go back to the recordings. Those will be on the website end of day today, hopefully, and take a moment to kind of review some of the conversations and information that they had shared on alternative grading systems, because I think this is a nice follow-up to a lot of those conversations, but you certainly didn't have to be present at those other workshops to engage in this one today. And so the goal of this session is to talk just briefly about ungrading, but how at least what my experience was in actually implementing it into a course, and some of the things that I think are important to think about if you are thinking about adding some element of ungrading into your own courses. And so if at any point you have questions, I'll try my best on my phone to kind of monitor the chat, but really feel free to unmute and jump right in, because I do want this to be very conversational. So in fact, I think, my sort of talking portion of this presentation shouldn't take too long. So, we should have, I think, plenty of time to discuss, what you're thinking about for your own courses, or any ideas that you want to bounce off of each other here. I think, all of us are here because we are somewhat interested in shaking up what we've been doing in our classes and trying something new. So if Jackie, you don't mind to move to the next slide. Thank you. So first, just as a warm up, I wanted us to think for a couple of minutes, and then, maybe a minute or so, what comes to mind when you think about grading? Has it shifted over time? Has it, is there any personal experiences that you had about grading that has sort of shaped your mindset around grading? So I want you to think about that for a moment, and then feel free to share out any feelings about grading. It's like a mini think, pair, share, but maybe not quite pairing, but all the sharing. So. Carolina, go for it.
Yes, so, I'm teaching physics, and I try to include as much as I can learning part within grading. For example, I have group work, and in group work, I give the students problems, and I go between them, etc. So on purpose, I grade the group work easier in order not to put pressure on the students making teams and say, oh, I did this and I'm so stupid and now the group got bad grade, etc. So they are graded easier and they know exactly about this. I explain it to them. While the quizzes is individual work, and I grade as it should be graded. So I think a big part of learning is in my class, those group works, which are once a week. Mm-hmm. So they are very important for the students. This is how they learn. But I had to to put, more emphasis on learning and less emphasis on grading, and it is done on purpose. It was not really from the beginning, so I changed it along the years, and I think it is very important. They really like it because they feel like it's a community of learning, and they want to know how to do things, and less, oh, I'm so terrified I'll get a 5 out of 10 and I'll fail my group if I don't do my portion or whatever. So that's part of it.
Excellent. I really like that. I think opening up those conversations with students about, shifting that focus on learning and kind of trying to break the mold of what they've, kind of been used to, and leveraging that peer expectations and peer support in their learning, I think is excellent. Anyone else? I think you're on mute, Jackie.
I tried to unmute and then I muted myself again. Thank you. One thing I was thinking about during the presentation this morning too is just the purpose of grading, and really refocusing it in thinking about feedback and measuring learning and how can that be accomplished, and not focusing on the points and the grade and those types of things, but even providing those spaces more for students to learn from each other as well. So that's what I was thinking about this morning too, about grading and feedback.
I know, in a lot of my courses over the years, I've always tried to emphasize the importance of feedback with my students. I've required drafts of work and revisions to be made, and and I know that there's a lot of people who use assignments like creating a document where students kind of point by point talk about the ways that they've addressed any revisions that they've made in their work. And I think there's, been maybe this sort of age-old question of how do we get students to actually incorporate the feedback that we spend so much time painstakingly giving to them. And for a lot of people, that seems to be, maybe creating an assignment or making it a required element of their grade. But what I like about ungrading, and I think Jackie kind of touched on this, is really creating that culture of feedback and focusing on that. And so I think that's something I've definitely learned in the process of using ungrading. Ramin?
Sorry, I'm still not very good at doing this on my phone.
You're good.
So when we talk about having students focus on learning and not grading, they have been culturated for 12, 15 years that grading is what matters. So you have to have some tactics. So one of the things, I'm just going to give you one example of something I tried this fall that I think people should consider. And it's in a low stake context, right? We often use low stake things to make sure we assess and let students assess whether they have learned something. But this one was a little different because I gave a quiz, multiple. I think I gave a total of 4 during the first few weeks of the course I taught this past fall, and had students to find another person and go over the answers the two gave and persuade each other why they thought when it was different. They thought they gave the answer they gave, or listen to why the other person gave the answer that they gave when it was different. And then, so this was not cheating, right? I mean, right in class, I told them to take their quiz, find another person. So part of my motivation was I need them to talk to each other. So that's part of my motivation. And this seemed like a perfectly fine vehicle for it. And the second one was the act of persuasion and listening is a critical part of what we're trying to accomplish. And, and so instead of getting an 8 out of 10 or whatever, you now got 10 out of 10 because of the fact that you had that conversation. But I felt that was a useful thing, and I think is a practice that I'm going to keep doing. Again, it's very low stakes. This is not going to give you an A as a result of doing it, but it's just a strategy to accomplish a number of different things. You can assume my hand is down. I just don't know how to turn it off yet.
I like that. I think, that fits really nicely into ungrading as a practice as well, because it's again shifting your focus of from this, very traditional grading system and this idea that their work is means to an end, but really kind of focusing on that collaborative element and building those skills that they're going to need for the rest of their lives, and whether it's in their career or future courses. I think it's ungrading, I think it does a good job of facilitating that and trying to leverage that peer support. So excellent. Anybody else? Any other thoughts about grading?
I'll
Or
share.
Go for it.
So this is gonna be only my second semester teaching coming up. And so for me in the first one, everything's kind of a whirlwind, but I was kind of struggling with how to grade, where in one class, the way the projects were set up, it made more sense to have a rubric and see if they actually did the requirements. But in the other one, it was more of, I don't care if they got the answer right or wrong. I care if they learned from it. And so I was struggling to be like, how do I grade that? So when this course came up for the workshop, I was like, this sounds exactly like what I'm trying to do here.
Yeah. I think it's I'm glad that you're joining us, and I'm a bit jealous that you're so early in your career and you're already here at this juncture of like, what is it that I'm actually trying to accomplish? Because I think, as Ramin had said, we've spent a majority of our lives kind of focused on grading, and it's a hard thing to shake, and I think it's a hard thing to kind of leave behind. But I'm excited for you that you're thinking about possibly adopting some kind of alternative grade. So Jackie, if you want to go ahead and move to the next slide. So I do want to share a little bit about what ungrading is. And that way we kind of have a common understanding. And then I'm actually going to revisit each of these main bullet points and talk about how it's, kind of worked out in my class and for the particular project I used ungrading for. But so, this isn't by no means a exhaustive list. It's by no means in it's just a list I've adapted from previous presentations that we've done on alternative grading. So I'm sure there are other resources out there, and I can definitely send you some of those resources. I actually meant to put a link in these slides about the resources that we've gathered on alternative grading systems. So I'll make sure I send that out to everyone who's attended at some point this week. But ungrading is a shift, right, from this focus on grades to a focus on learning. And I have in here parentheses almost, because we are still in a university structure that requires some grade to be submitted at the end of the semester. So there's no escaping the idea of a grade altogether, right? We are bound by policy to submit grades for our students, and so they are there, but we're trying to again kind of create this culture of learning and collaborative learning, and to work on shifting the idea that all of the output and the outcomes in our class are worth something in this kind of external, maybe even vague categorization kind of way, but that the learning that is central to what we want our students to have is what we want our students to kind of focus on. So this requires very clear and achievable learning objectives, and all of our learning objectives should be clear and achievable. And I think this was one of those pillars that Robert Talbert was talking about in our earlier session here. So I kind of included an example here from from one of my courses coming up this semester that I plan to use elements of ungrading in, and that includes it's evaluating empirical evidence related to deterrence and capital punishment. So it's a very clear action that they should be able to evaluate empirical evidence as it relates to this punishment philosophy and a type of punishment that we see in our criminal justice system. And so when you are thinking about ungrading, I think it also causes us to then revisit some of those learning objectives and to create things that are a bit more focused and a bit more measurable than we might have something like understand, and understand can be a really difficult concept to measure. And so it does, I think, kind of force us to revisit some of the goals that we have for our students in the class. Ungrading involves students in their own assessment, and this is often looks like using self-assessments to regularly check in on progress on how our students are achieving the learning objectives. So what I really like about ungrading is that it puts the onus of learning on our students. So it forces them to become active learners in the classroom, and it requires that they gather evidence to support their learning and their achievement of their learning. And so I'll show you, I think, a couple of I had originally had multiple links in here I was going to click on and then show, but hopefully they work so that Jackie might be able to click on them here in a couple of slides, but not on this slide, Jackie, but in a couple slides, I think. I'll show you some of those self-assessments. It also requires regular feedback from the instructor. So as we have been talking about, kind of creating that system of, or that culture of feedback, and I think I've read it somewhere as this sort of policy of no grades but all feedback, and really creating that feedback loop so that students can try and try again to master the material. And then grades are determined by having a conversation with faculty, and this is typically done at both the midterm and the final. If you're teaching a first-year level course, you're required to provide a midterm grade, and so this, having a midterm conversation not only gives students kind of an awareness of where they are in the course, but for those first-year classes, it might very well be required for you to submit something to the registrar. And so thinking about setting aside, time for those conversations is an important consideration that I'll jump into here in a minute. But in these conversations, students should be able to demonstrate how they've achieved each of these learning objectives, and either through their self-assessments, where you can sit down with the student and show and go through their self-assessment together, or by reviewing the work that they've submitted so far. And then ultimately, the purpose of these meetings is for both the faculty and the student to mutually agree on a grade. And so there's a lot in here that I think sparked a lot of fear for me when I first decided to embark on an ungrading journey. But it, as we're going to kind of talk about, it didn't turn out as bad as I thought it was going to. So, Jackie, if you want to move to the next slide. All right. So, I want to emphasize that you don't have to go all or nothing with alternative grading systems. And by that, I mean, you can use ungrading in certain pieces of your course. It doesn't have to be used in every single assessment. It doesn't have to be used for every exam or every assignment or project that you do in your class. You can really jump into this using baby steps. And that's essentially what I did with my senior seminar course. I used ungrading only in my unessay assignment, which I think kind of naturally led to and I'm actually going to do a, if you could go back to the previous slide, I think, or maybe another previous slide. One more.
Sorry,
Probably,
skipped ahead.
oh, are we skipping ahead? Oops. Oh, sorry. Did it maybe go back to the, I think maybe the 4th slide? Okay, yeah.
Sorry about that.
Here.
My hand slipped as I was trying to. do
No,
something.
it's okay. It's okay. It's a little, tricky to, but I really appreciate you helping me with this. Okay, where was I? So, I think part of, using this in, just one project in my course kind of allowed myself to get used to the idea. It allowed my students to kind of get used to the idea of ungrading, and it also kind of allowed me to work out any issues within that particular assessment without feeling like the entire class was overwhelming, or that anything was kind of spiraling out of control. So I do recommend that if ungrading feels a bit daunting to you, pick one assessment to start with, or any alternative grading system. Pick one assessment to start with, and see how it works. And then in future semesters, you might expand it, or you might keep it just the way you did. I think it gives. I think we need to remember that it is kind of a risky proposition to abandon a traditional grading system, and replace it with something like ungrading. But I think it's the rewards of doing so can be, it can be really worth it. I think, at least it was for me, and I hope if you dive into it, it will be for you as well. Again, this zero focus on grades and focus on learning. I was thinking a lot, and Ramin, you said that we've, our students, ourselves, we've basically grown up with an idea that our achievement in learning is focused on a grade. I think even my toddler gets satisfactory and unsatisfactory, and I think they say satisfactory and needs encouragement report cards in his daycare class. And so it's, from very young ages, we are kind of socialized into thinking about our achievement in a way that is summarized by this one value, right? And so if we kind of remember that it's been decades for some of us that we've been in this culture of traditional grading, it means it takes a lot of buy-in for us to start, and a lot of trust to shift that mindset. And some of that can be accomplished through in talking with your students about why you're engaging in a alternative grading assessment, and being really transparent in keeping them abreast of where they stand at any given point in the course. And so it takes our own buy-in, right? We have to think about our own teaching ideology and what we want our students. And I think a lot of us have engaged in that self-reflection to think about what we want our students to walk away from our courses with. And, if we can get our own buy-in and we can get our students buy-in, it's really going to make a difference in how, I guess, successful, or how smoothly something like ungrading might operate in your classroom. So just a couple of, things I think are really key to ungrading is to really be open with your students. Start right at the beginning of the class, talking about why you're going to shift away from this traditional grading system. Talk about some of the concerns that you have with it. the responsibility it gives to students and the skills that you want, that you think they're going to gain from this process of ungrading. And I think, we've talked about it, and Jackie, your presentation right before this one was talking about career competencies. And I know with conversations with my husband, who's in a marketing firm, all of their yearly reviews are essentially a practice of ungrading. It requires each individual to gather evidence and to make an argument about how they've achieved the goals that they've wanted to achieve throughout a year. And that's how, all of their promotions and their, raises, and, that's how a lot of things are assessed, and it's done in a conversation with a supervisor. And so this isn't really any different from what a lot of people, what I would probably argue a majority of people, find in the workplace. And so to have that conversation with students right off the get-go is one way you can try to create that buy-in with students. And, again, early and often having those conversations. Jackie, if you want to move to the next slide. Again, it involves students in their own assessment. And so I was inspired to tackle the unessay and to use ungrading in my senior seminar course by Jessamine Newhouse, who is our colleague over at SUNY Plattsburgh. She's the CLT director there and author of Geeky Pedagogy. And I actually used a lot of the self-assessments, and I've adapted them that she's provided on her website, Geeky Pedagogy. So I think if you click on that example of self-assessment, that'll actually bring you to my self-assessment that I used for the unessay and for class. And I have, you can kind of go through that if you want to, okay, maybe I have to send that out to everybody. I'm not quite sure. If you drop it in the chat, maybe it will work. I think I have it set that anyone can view it. So take a look at it. This was again adapted from Jessamine Newhouse's work that she's provided on her website. And there's actually a few things I would change about this, mostly that I would have students engage in the self-assessment practice on a more regular basis. And I really had the self-assessment focused on the final outcome, not on every iteration of the work that they completed in the course. And so there's, I think there's a lot of ways to, adapt and to have this evolve in different ways. So remember, this is my first iteration of a self-assessment. So take it with a grain of salt. But another thing I think I would change about it is to have some more open-ended questions about achieving the learning outcomes. I did have students talk about this more concretely in one of their final assignments of the unessay project, but I think having that woven into the self-assessment and for them to kind of regularly check in on that would have been, a helpful practice as well. And then finally, I plan to actually, instead of having this, Google Doc copy that the students had to download and then fill out and then resubmit into the LMS, I think I'm actually going to just use the LMS. There is a self-assessment option in Brightspace that I plan to use, but you could also certainly do something like this in a Google form that would create all of that, or keep all of that information organized for all of the students. So those are just a couple of things I think I would have changed that I could think of at the moment. And really, the self-assessment was really helpful in that it served as a starting point for all of those midterm and final exam meetings with students. And as I mentioned before, it really, I think, creates it puts some importance on their self-advocacy and their ability to communicate both orally and written, and to work not only with myself, but they also had options to do peer assessments as well. But I think to have this practice of assessment was a really important skill for them to learn. So if you want to move to the next slide, if you're able to. Excellent. Okay, so I was really nervous about this idea of giving students unlimited opportunities for revising, but I did it anyway. And I will say that big caveat here is I did this for 2 classes that had 15, one of the classes had 17 students enrolled in it. So these were very small classes. How this would scale is something I have not yet tried to do. I'm going to try to scale it to a larger class this upcoming semester, but if you're teaching a large lecture with 100+ students, this I'm not sure exactly how this would scale for you. I'm not sure I would be brave enough to do an unlimited feedback, but I will say that on average, most students resubmitted their work 2 to 3 times. And some of the things I tried to do to safeguard my time was to put pretty strict page and word limits. So I really actually just focused on a maximum word count or a maximum page limit. And I always had students, butting up against that maximum page limit. And I made them, rather short. So I required that their proposal be no more than 2 pages each, so that when I was going through iterations of their work, I wasn't drowning in hundreds of pages of work each time. And that also had a benefit of requiring the students to be very concise and to be very direct in their communication in their assignments. So I actually think having maximum page limits can be a really beneficial thing. I also included exemplars of the work that I expected them to achieve. This gave them an idea of what to expect, but it also, I think, made them focus on the most pertinent information and not adding in extraneous work that's just filled a particular page limit, right, or a page minimum. So those are some of the things I did to try to safeguard some of that time. I did use hard and soft deadlines in this process. So I gave recommended deadlines for revisions, and I gave a hard deadline of the last day of classes so that I had, time during our final exam week, which I used for our final exam meetings, to review their work, and to have enough time to do that. So it did require some careful scheduling as well, and also some very clear communication with students about how long they had to create their rewrites, and what the timeline and feedback would be for my once they submitted it, how long they could expect my feedback to take. Brightspace actually notifies you every time you have a new submission, and I actually required them all to use the same submission link every rewrite. So if a student was submitting their project proposal, they could resubmit that project proposal in the same link over and over again, and I would be able to see both their original proposal and any previous iterations and rewrites that they had done. So I could see my comments on it. I could see the changes they made in the second draft. I could see my comments on that second draft. And then I could see what their third draft looked like. It was actually, I think Brightspace made that process really easy to, toggle back and forth with their original submissions and every rewrite that they completed and submitted to me. So it was, okay. The network is back up on campus. Okay. Well, that is good news. I'm going to continue moving on in this. And then, again, that those conversations of, oops, I think, yes. Okay. And the one thing I was surprised by is every single student incorporated the revisions that I required them or I expected them to do. And most of the students, not all the students, but I would say a vast majority of students completed all of the revisions until there was no more feedback to incorporate. And that I think was surprising for me, because previously in other courses, they would complete, I'd give them, I don't know, dozens of comments on their research proposals, and they would incorporate all of the easy suggestions, and then they wouldn't do the really hard restructuring comments that I, had asked them to do or thought their papers would benefit from. And so by the time I got their final draft or their final paper, they might have done half of the comments. They might have addressed half of the feedback, and they would leave the other, half by the wayside. But for the most part, the students really became committed to incorporating all of the feedback. And again, I had a handful of students who were like, "Yeah, this is good enough. I'm not going to go back and do that." And that was on them, right? If they didn't want to do that, they didn't have to. But that was part of the conversation that we would have at the end of the semester. So if you want to move to the next slide. Excellent. So about those conversations. All right. So I'm young, I'm female. I am not socialized to be confrontational with any human in this world. And so it was really, really nerve-wracking for me to then sit down with students and say, okay, let's talk about and agree upon your grade, because I was so afraid we were going to have this like major conflict. There was going to be, raised voices and heated arguments about, where the grades would be, because previously I would use a rubric, or I would have a grading scheme in my syllabus, in my, assignment instructions and so forth. But it was a very like solitary experience. I would just go through, grade as I saw fit. Occasionally I'd get a student asking why, and I would, send them an email and maybe explain a little bit more about it. But it was all very, it felt like a very solitary exercise. It felt like I was just sitting in my little ivory tower, writing about, their grades, and then, dishing them out without really any second thought. Because more often than not, students wouldn't question about the grade that they received. They would, just accept it, and we'd all move on, and never engage in a conversation about why they've achieved, or, why they've earned the grade that they've earned. And this process of having a conversation, as nerve-wracking as it was, I think it was both a good experience for me as a professor to really take notice that this should be a conversation that I'm having with my students, but it also gave them that really good practice of advocating for themselves and to make an argument based on evidence, right? That's what a lot of us in social sciences are constantly trying to have our students walk away with. And the and to incorporate this in your grading, I think is a really powerful example of that. So of course, some concerns, right? Dunning-Kruger effect, that people who don't know overestimate their knowledge, right? So I was very nervous about students thinking that they deserved an A, when really the work and the quality of their work was C or B, or, some other lower scale, level. And really, I only had one student, and I could see that student a mile away, from the first couple of interactions. I was like, yeah, that's going to be my student who does this. And it was. And in the end, when we had that conversation, we just reviewed all of the evidence. We talked about the number of times they incorporated feedback. We talked about, the challenge, or the level of challenge and rigor in their project. And ultimately they agreed with the grade assessment I was prepared to give them. And so it really didn't become this big heated conflict that I had expected it to. Really, more often than not, I ran into the stereotype threat where, particularly in my class, I saw this particularly among our female students and female students of color, but really many students of color often underestimated the quality of their work. And this was a little bit different. I guess I didn't expect it as much. And then it turned out that nearly all of my female students and most of my students of color were underestimating their work relative to their peers. And this is, my anecdata, right? It's an anecdote. It's not necessarily, great quantitative data, but it is something that I noticed pretty readily in these conversations. And I didn't let them underestimate their work. We spent a lot of time, those conversations were longer, but we spent a lot of time talking about the evidence of their work throughout the course. And some of them needed a bit more encouragement. Some of them, I had to say, I think you really need to reconsider the grade you're assigning yourself. And then they would sort of creep down, and then they'd creep back up, and then finally we'd get to a place where I said, I think that's a fair assessment. And so that actually, I think, was one of the more surprising parts of these conversations that I had with students. So if you want to move to the next slide, then. Okay, so really, in the end, kind of talking about, or having done ungrading in exactly two classes in one semester. So I'm not going to argue that I've done this so many times, that I've worked out all of the issues and all of the and I don't feel like I have years of experience under my belt to kind of share this, but I think in some ways it's really important to capture these thoughts after the very first time of incorporating ungrading into a classroom, because I think this is, it's a starting point, right? It did feel much more aligned with my teaching philosophy. I walked away after, submitting grades feeling like, yep, this was exactly the distribution I thought I would get if it were a previous course. It really did mirror the distribution of grades that I had in previous courses for that particular class. And so, it really, it wasn't as surprising in that aspect as I thought it was going to be. I thought it was going to feel a lot different, but really it felt, it felt much more aligned with what I was hoping we would get out of the class. It did require a lot more preparation, both mentally and otherwise. It required a lot of attention throughout the semester. The rewrites were surprisingly manageable, I think, because of those safeguards, certainly because I had smaller class sizes that I was doing this in. So again, scaling it feels a bit more daunting, but I'd be interested to hear anyone's thoughts on potentially scaling it to larger classes as well. It shifted my role in the class. I felt like I was more of a facilitator, not this sort of big authority figure that would be throwing grades out at my students left and right, without, really any sort of back and forth with students. It really did feel like I was helping them achieve their learning objectives, I don't know, in a more tangible way. I was more satisfied with the student work, and I didn't dread grading, so that was helpful. It was very nice to go into our final exam week to meet with all of the students, and essentially it was kind of like an oral exam where we could just walk in together, talk about what they've learned in the class. They were able to demonstrate more of that learning in those meetings, which would help kind of shift whether that grade became a plus or a minus, and so forth. And it really, I don't know, for me, it was a lot, it was a lot more fun, I think, than I expected it to be. And the students' anecdata, again, seem to be more satisfied with the work and their connections to their future, both here at Oswego and beyond. It was very stressful at the beginning for students because I think, again, being very ingrained that grades are the only important thing that come out of a classroom, it was really hard to kind of shift their focus and to kind of gain that trust that I wasn't going to surprise them with some grade that they weren't aware of because, they hadn't gotten marks throughout the semester with them. It really did take a lot of trust between us to feel comfortable with that. So anyways, that is kind of my spiel on all of this. But has anyone got thoughts or questions? Sorry, Ramin, I don't know if that hand raise is still there from before.
No,
or if
that's
that's
new. That's new.
new.
I'm on the
Yeah,
computer
jump in.
now.
Sorry, I wasn't over on that side of the,
No, that's
I
all
had to
right.
slide over to see that, so.
I'm still stuck on women and students of color underestimating their performance. So my question is this.
Mhm.
In a typical traditional grading construct, so you get an 80 or get a 50 or get a 90 or whatever, then you are getting, okay, I'm at this point, I'm at a C level or B level or whatever. And,
Yeah.
in Brightspace, we post averages or letter grades as grades change. And I'm just wondering if there is a way embedded in this ungrading structure to provide affirmations or other things that clarify that, after those multiple iterations of activity, that final piece was really good or good enough. Or I don't know. I'm not suggesting I know what the right thing to do is, but something
Yeah.
that perhaps enable people at the end to better judge where
Yeah.
they're at.
So, we did and I did have, I do think about one conversation I had with a student who, fit that kind of identity, who, felt like they did need more of that affirmation throughout the semester, that they needed to know that their project was challenging enough, that it was, because they saw some of the other students' presentations of their work, and then they got very nervous that their own work wasn't to that level. And so I think that is a good point, and I think that is something that would be really helpful to particularly combat, some of that stereotype threat, to add a bit more affirming or place to validate some of that. And I think that that's partly why I don't like that I didn't do the self-assessment on a more regular basis, because some of those categories had things like, did you meet the page limit, yes or no, right? Did you address specifically this learning objective, yes or no? Or did you mostly cite things appropriately? And I think having that at multiple time points across the semester would have helped with that, for sure. And Teo has added, my ANIC data supports the same populations underestimating and overestimating their work in self-assessment. So it is something I think you have to be aware of when you're implementing this, and it's something I think is actually an important conversation to have with students before you get to that point. And maybe that was probably something I should have done too, to say, research anecdata, had shown that, we often aren't, people of varying identities may not, may overestimate their work, may underestimate their work, and, to be aware of that going into those meetings. So that way they're not blindsided by the, sort of conversation, that in what direction the conversation goes in. Because I could see, especially among women, female students, getting kind of visibly uncomfortable with like trying to advocate for a higher grade. And it makes me think a lot about like, asking for higher salaries and how difficult that is for people who are socialized not to do that. And so this, I think I can see how this would have benefits across multiple contexts. Teo?
Yeah, I just want to add, so the context for mine was over a series of like relatively short, like 1 or 2 page assignments, each self-assessed individually. And
Mhm.
so this is in a class of like 95. And so a fairly substantial sample. And I really found that giving like little bits of feedback where I would point out you did this better than you think. Just saying
Yeah,
that a few times, it did over the assignments, it tended to kind of level out a little bit with those students.
that's good to know.
Not all of them. There were definitely a few who were like, no, I'm a C student, I insist. And I'm like, you're writing 3 times as much as some of the other people. Like, and I don't know how to get this across to you. But so
Yeah.
I feel like that's going to be an ongoing struggle. And I feel like we're kind of up against, years of implicit bias at minimum
Right.
and that kind of thing. But it
Yeah.
you can move the needle, I think, with feedback.
Mhm. And I think I should mention too that not only like do kind of shifting this assessment, and I should also apologize. I do this to my students all the time. I say we're going to have so much time at the end of this session, and then I never do because I'm long-winded, and I need to remember that about myself. And so my apologies, because we are a little bit over time right now, but I think also it's probably very easy, or at least easier, for me as a white woman to shift up some of these, to change up some of these grading schemes and this grading policy without as much pushback as our colleagues of color might have. And so that's something I think we also, have to keep in mind and give ourselves grace with, that, it may not be received as well by students, depending on some of those factors. And so there is a little more work and labor involved with some faculty, which is unfortunate. But I guess I don't want to present this as like it's easy, everyone can do it kind of thing, because people might really run into some hard obstacles to that, and I don't want to minimize that at all. And that's something Jessamine Newhouse talks a lot about in her book on what a professor looks like. So I can sing Jessamine's praises all day long. But anyone else, any thoughts? Or yeah, Carolina? And I understand that we are over time, so if you have to run out.
Yeah, thank you, Mandy. So I tried this in my labs actually. Before the students had a lab report which was kind of set in stone and so on, though I allowed them to submit them a little bit later sometimes. But this semester I allowed them to resubmit if they saw that they had feedback and they did some mistakes. And I noticed that my distribution got into 2 Gaussians, so the good students, they try to do a perfect job practically, while the not so good students, or practically those who didn't want to even submit lab report, there are such students too, they actually had more chance to even submit something and pass the class technically. But I couldn't move them so far as to, everybody to become perfect A and so on. But still, I gave them this option, and I thought, oh, we can submit even next week or in 2 weeks. And as you said, with soft and hard deadlines, it was the hard deadline, but they had a soft deadline 1 week after the lab, but then they could submit it further, and I encouraged them to submit. And actually I went to every one of them and I talked to them. I need your lab reports, you can do it, and so on. So I diminished the number of failures in the class, because before, if you have a very hard deadline, some students may not do it, and then they are at peace with it. I didn't submit, that's it, is done. So then they fail. So you have more students failing class, failing, getting out of school, etc. So this way I try to give them more chance and to have a work in progress and to have a different perspective on their work and on their chances in a way.
Yeah,
Thank you.
absolutely. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. So is anyone thinking about doing ungrading in their classes?
I can tell you some of our computer science faculty who teach lower division CS courses
Baby steps.
have a significant use of those show me your work. I mean, but that's mostly
Mhm.
because they think people are cheating without some type of a, if you can't explain your code, then I have to wonder if you actually produce the code. So those meetings that you have incorporated, which are not intended for the same purposes as CS faculty are using it, kind of take away the whole idea of somebody else writing your paper, right? I
Yeah.
mean, it's just one of those where, you know, you better have done the work if you're going to defend it or explain it or
Yeah.
whatever. And that's kind of the where I've seen it used pretty significantly. But their concern is that some kid in Korea is writing this student's code and paying, you know, who paid $50 for it. I mean, it just, you know, it
Yeah.
is what it is. I mean, it happens, and
Yeah.
and you see why people want to do it. So I definitely like the idea of incorporating those interview conversational pieces as part of the, you know, that determine the final grade. And I've been involved in courses in grad school that have done it that way too, which
Yeah.
you know, I can see significant benefits from.
Yeah. No, that's a really good point too, because I think there are a lot of conversations about AI and cheating, and that having this structure does have kind of a natural way of hopefully preventing some of that. But I really think that it also, I found, um at least I like to think, that it helped overall with my engagement with students in the class, because they couldn't just sit back and be passive in this process, right? They had to be very engaged in the project and in our conversations about their progress in the class. And so I think the benefits do bleed over in other areas too, for sure. I think that, yeah, the scaling problem is, I don't mean to keep going back to that, but because I think it's very easy for me to be like, oh, this was a wonderful success in my class of 15 students, but not all of us, have that experience of getting to teach a small seminar style of 15 students. And so I don't want to oversell, my positive experience, because I do think that's an important, caveat to that. Anyone?
I did do, again, not the complete ungrading and not a complete unessay, but
Mhm.
like the short written assignments, again, if you give them a detailed rubric and like I think the biggest shift, the biggest takeaway I have from scaling it up that much was to keep their response as small as possible.
Yeah.
But it's also, the thing is, I feel like I need to put more upfront in each assignment about purpose and objective and
Yeah.
why are you doing this? And I think that's the thing I found got the most buy-in from students, was being like,
Mhm.
why are you here? Like, you're the one, you're paying for this. I'm not forcing you to be here. Why am I asking you to do this assignment? And kind of trying to frame that as cleanly and clearly as possible, so that, and giving some options for it, especially like in a field like ours, where it's, people may have many different motivations for being in your degree program. Just giving them hooks into like, this can relate to what you want to do, I think is going to be really
Yeah.
helpful for getting them to be like, oh, okay, that's why I'm doing this assignment. I think for the
Absolutely.
scaling, that's sort of the important thing.
Thank you for sharing that, Ramin.
So going back to the CS example, CSE 212, which is our introductory computer science course, is taught to typically 130, 140 people in a large lecture situation. And those meetings that I mentioned are done primarily by the TAs. They're not done by the faculty. So the course, in a large scale situation, the time you spend is training the TAs in accommodating those feedback structures, which can't be small, but it certainly does not explode in terms of your workload, right? If they're trained well enough, they're good, and they're going to learn something from it too, right? I mean, that those types of, at least in my experience, the upper division students that help in these contexts, they can benefit greatly in learning good communication skills, because you do have to explain why something needs to be done differently. And that's not an easy thing to do. I mean, we do that for a living on a regular basis, but believe me, most people aren't necessarily equipped to do it. So,
Yeah.
my recommendation would be if somebody were to try this on grading in the context of a bigger course, you kind of have to have some support structure that lets you do it. I don't know if you could
Yeah.
do what Maggie does in a
Right.
class of 100.
Excellent. All right. Well, again, my apologies for being as long-winded as I am. And having us go over almost 10 minutes on time. I do want to be, respectful that everyone's probably got other things that they've got planned in this 3 o'clock hour. But thank you so much for being here with me today. If you have any questions, well, thank you, Teo, for making me feel better about that. I think I tend to ramble, so there's that too. But I'm always open to have these conversations with people. I'm going to be doing this again this semester in my classes, and would love to, keep, talking with everyone and workshopping ideas and, sharing that together. So thank you again, everyone.
Thank you.
And I'm going to try to get this recording finished. Maybe. Keeps